Japanese-Russian relations. Russian geographers learned about Japan in the late 17th century. Catherine the Great attempted but failed to open trade relations in 1793. America, aware of Russia's attempt to open trade, used force under Millard Fillmore to present a letter to the Emperor Abe Mashiro. The shogunate was left to decide if they should open their borders, and in 1854 a treaty was written. By 1858, full trade would commence, with 4 more treaties being developed with superpowers including Russia. There's a little surprise concerning Fillmore's confusion about who was the ruler of Japan. Government by shogunate began August 21st, 1192, by Minamoto Yoritomo. This established Japan's first military government. Before this, the military were not considered to be of any supreme importance. Shinto and Buddhism did not venerate the warrior, and until this time, Japan was run more generally by the spiritual and economic elite. 3 major shogunates led Japan until 1868, and America knew little about the history of Japan in general up until the 18th century. Since then, we have been both at war with Japan and have been allied to Japan. Another major superpower, Russia, can claim the same. The shogunate worked well for America, and trade went well for many years, as Japan modernized and looked toward a more democratic government. U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant advised to keep change slow. By the 19th century, Japan was ready to grow its borders and join the ranks of other imperial states. Ironically, the same country that brought so much of Japan its culture, Korea, became the target for expansion of the Japanese nation. When Japan went to war and defeated Manchuria in northeast China at the beginning of 1932, these lands above Korea were labeled Manchuria by Japan to associate them with the island nation. This aggression by Japan brought the world's superpowers together, and a treaty was formed to force Japan to relinquish this part of the world. Following this loss of power, Russia quickly showed its own interest in ruling modern Manchuria. By 1932, Japan had affirmed their puppet state of Manchukuo and then described the will of the Manchu people. China appealed the seizure, claiming it to be illegal. The League of Nations decided the government was not set up by the will of the Manchu people, furthering tensions on a world scale. This unofficial colony of Japan was not given much care, and drug abuse and plague became rampant. War with China became inevitable, but Russia was also bringing the heat up in the beginning of World War II. In April 1941, there was a neutrality agreement made between Japan and Russia. The tripartite pact Japan made with Italy and Germany secured their place as an Axis player in the war, and the bombing of Pearl Harbor famously gave America the cover to officially join World War II, the result being the ending of World War II and the subsequent bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Before this could happen, though, Russia was allowed the southern part of Sakhalin and the Port Arthur naval base in Manchuria. As smaller nations fare, and particularly young ones at that, Japan has secured a very strong place in the world. The nation has shifted loyalties many times, and this only makes sense when considering how fragile the political landscape that surrounds it is. At times, Japan has been on the defensive, and at times it has made offensive moves to grow its empire. After the end of World War II, Japan was forced to move toward less military growth and famously focused on technology instead. At least while the U.S.-Japan security alliance has been presented this way, instead it might be more apt to say that Japan has outsourced its protection to the United States, with more U.S. military personnel now being stationed in Japan than any other country. This protection makes Japan's and the United States' interests more closely aligned for now, and maybe into the future, as Vladimir Putin's escalation into nearby Ukraine and Eurasia further strengthens the bond between the U.S. and Japan, as well as many other world superpowers. Presently, the war in Ukraine is putting a great strain on Russia. Support by some of its previous allies are waning as they are losing faith in Putin's vision for his kleptocracy. There's been outsized support militarily by North Korea to help supply the war. North Korea hardly has the resources to help with their own empire building, and though there is little way to prove exactly how many weapons have been traded, due to the secrecy of Stalinist dictatorships. Still, there should be great reservation involving Putin's recent meetings with Kim Jong-un, who recently visited Moscow under the pretense of 75 years since North Korea's founding. North Korea has a vested interest in Russia's backing and might be a threat to the borders of our ally Japan. In contrast to this visit, the national security advisors of South Korea, the U.S., and Japan met in Seoul to discuss trilateral cooperation on North Korea. By no means are these world powers sitting idly by, and when you compare this to the divisive history between these factions, it really comes to no surprise that there is a spotlight on these conflicts. Of course, the present times are rife with burgeoning nations vying for a place on the world economic stage. Central Asia's rise to prominence due to demand for oil and mineral resources is quickly becoming a new partner for Japan to ally with, furthering their protection by historically strong foils to China and Russia's control over the Eastern world. It appears Japan, along with the U.S., are wooing Kyrgyzstan particularly to divest in Russia, and at the Central Asia Summit in 2024, the agenda might include creating a Caspian Sea transportation route that bypasses Russia entirely. Attempts to block Russia seems to be growing on the world stage, and Japan has both a strong role and is allied with the U.S., further enhancing the fragile world relationships that have been unveiled since Putin's expansionist movement. Further compounding this contemporary issue is the generation gap in Japan, including changing values, showing alliances in Japan changing from Russia to the West. Pro-Russian lobbies in Japan exist, and they are run by older, more conservative Japanese people. Japan Premier Shinzo Abe worked hard to open Japan-Russian relations in the 2010s, and some are still on board with his policies to woo influence in Moscow to leverage against China. Not only is the war in Ukraine unpopular, the corrupt business managers have made trust in businesses with Russia unpopular. Russia also doesn't have much to offer Japan in the way of trade, at least not compared to China. Japan seems pulled in many directions since the Second World War, but the U.S. has also seen changes in alliances as well, with some in the United States business class also willing to open relations to Russia and Russian allies due to modern needs for semi-precious minerals that are used in technology and computing. On the other hand, the government seems to be in contention with many business interests since the G7 leaders that include Japan and the U.S. gathered in December in a show of support for Ukraine. While there is no talk of a full-blown war, allegiances clearly are developing around this prospect. The main issue seems to surround North Korea and Russia's alliance. North Korea has supplied very many weapons to Russia. These ties are strong, while Japan's have weakened. These neighbors have had a relationship that is long, storied, and often struggled. How the Koreas, China, Japan, Russia, and the U.S. make moves into the future is an issue that many experts in the field are keeping a very close eye on. When most people think of Cantonese, they would probably see no issue to be had. It is a widespread language. It was considered one of the two major dialects of Chinese, Mandarin being the second. Cantonese describes anyone who comes from the southern Chinese province of Guangdong. The meaning more specifically stated is someone from the capital city, Guangzhou. Cantonese is the dialect of the people from this southern province. Many Chinese American people speak both Cantonese and English. It is a language that is taught in many colleges and is under attack by the Chinese government. Of all the Chinese dialects, Cantonese is a written language developed in a very unique way, with written characters that are decisively unlike that of China's official language of Mandarin. Cantonese has many characters that are not only exclusive to Cantonese. These words can be written very differently on a whim under certain guidelines. The shifting, often unintelligible to the police form of language confuses him. Since they are unequipped to parse it in a speedy manner, there's a crackdown on its use being implemented in the city of Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, Cantonese is very unique to the city, with inflection to the spoken language resembling the speech patterns of, say, patois, or maybe a better term being lingua franca, that would resist, that in other regions have been considered, or should I say, taboo of sorts until they're not. Cantonese is unique in that it was commonly accepted and is slowly becoming taboo, even though it is, again, spoken by many people. There are many more English words that are included in Hong Kong Cantonese, and the practitioners are accused of something called lazy mouth, which ineloquently describes a dropping of some consonants. For these reasons and more that I will discuss, Cantonese speakers in Hong Kong are becoming increasingly under worry of government reprisal for speaking it. This fear of loss of insular control over the country is not new for China. There were many instances of this mostly landlocked nation tightening its control due to tradition. Neo-Confucianism was in conflict with New Learning, for example, in the 20th century. More communication with the rest of the world places communist China under Mao in a precarious position. In the last century, the majority of the people would rebel against authoritarian rule if there were more progressive voices from outside the country allowed in. At least this was the thought. The post-Mao reform era might be more open to world trade, and we've seen this in the last 30 years with Chinese performers being allowed to travel much more freely than they have in my earlier lifetime. But there's still reticence to change, and most likely because of the class divide in China, it is exacerbated by the dynastic traditions of autocratic wealth and power hoarding by those dynasties and their regents. The people of Hong Kong have a history of being more prone to protest, as is not necessarily under the same societal pressures as China, due to being a British colony until 1997. Though we might think of the Tiananmen Square protest in 1989, the more recent Hong Kong protests met with extreme violence from the government. The 2019 Hong Kong protests hinged on the fact that the government of Hong Kong proposed a bill allowing extradition of prisoners to mainland China, Taiwan, and other surrounding locales. The people of Hong Kong most likely sensed a reversion to China's fraught history of human rights abuses, and understandably so. The meandering capital of China has caused many issues on its own, with southern Chinese culture not always matching with the north. Hong Kong often clashes with mainland China because it was occupied by Japan. However, Cantonese is spoken by over 75 million people. To smear it by calling it ugly is clearly xenophobic. Anecdotally, a vocal music star from Hong Kong, a cantopop singer, Isan Chan Yikshun, was heckled by crowd members in Macau to speak Mandarin. It seems improbable to imagine such a large culture being forced to concede to the larger empire, but it has happened in the past, and it could certainly happen again. By smearing Cantonese as ugly or unworthy of being taught, the risk of many cultural touchstones that are regarded by millions to be essential to their cultural identity might be destroyed. To suggest that Cantonese is ugly and anathema to traditional Chinese is a smear of a very high order. Jessica Xiao is an immigrant from the Guangdong province. She lived in San Francisco from the age of 10. She points out that many Cantonese words used in modern speaking can be traced back to the ancient poems of the Tang dynasty. I would imagine that there are also connections to the Song dynasty as well, and it seems ironic that there is a reversal of the Sinicization of the coastal Chinese southern provinces. The Song dynasty might have been brutal but its contribution to Chinese culture was immense, and as well was the previous Tang dynasty. The upheaval of the modern age has clearly made the nation of China less cohesive. It is not surprising that there is a clamping down of freedom in a country that is still shaking off centuries of sometimes enforced conformity and supplication to the state. Jump to the present, the Chinese Communist Party ended the teaching of Mongolian language in Inner Mongolia in 2021, so it's not unheard of again. There seems to be no slowing down of the suppression of any unconformity of mainland China rule. As an American, I've witnessed the extinction of many native languages. When diversity is codified, the loss of a sense of humanity and connection to the past is lost. It's gone. There's no reason beyond the hegemonic rule of a modern post-Soviet China to enforce language dictatorship. While Hong Kong, being situated so closely to Guangzhou, gives the two very major metropolises an outsized influence over the Chinese economy, this could possibly be one reason that this conformity of language is being enforced. But regardless of the reason, the excuse for the stigmatization of Cantonese is its use in modern Chinese rebellion. It's the rebellion they want to quash, and Cantonese is a big part of that. With the younger people in Hong Kong who live in a split universe, aware of a world much different than that of Mao's Soviet China. And the Chinese people in Hong Kong protested in memory of the Tiananmen Square massacre and continued to act as a thorn in the side of the modern, less than stellar reforms and human rights abuses. I personally believe China can do a lot to improve and will. Honestly, I don't see them separating themselves further from world politics. But issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the rebellion of the youth in China are going to continue to exacerbate their construction of their own identity, which has been lost quite a bit since Mao's revolution. In August of 2023, Hong Kong's National Security Police put the people who are trying to maintain the speaking of Cantonese to trial. They entered the home of some of the family members of the Hong Kong Language Association. This group was formed in 2013. The goal was promoting the Cantonese language. The goal of the police, who did not have a search warrant, was to intimidate the group to remove an essay from its website. The essay was a work of fiction submitted to the group's literary competition. Readers of Philip K. Dick might feel very concerning parallels to the science fiction writer's view on fascism, especially in his speculative fiction novel, The Man in the High Castle. In that story, the MacGuffin was also a work of fiction that had the potential to harm the burgeoning communist state being developed in the U.S. under the assumption that the Allies had lost World War II. But I digress. The Chinese government is oppressing their own people, and that is in itself not news. But I imagine very few Americans know about the enforced curtailing of the use of Cantonese. In my research, articles I read a year ago when I learned about this subject have just disappeared from the web. There was not much to go by to make this essay, but I do hope that I found enough, and I think I've given a fairly thorough survey over the subject. So I appreciate your listening and watching, and I hope that Cantonese will live a long life as a language, and its suppression will not fully occur. Thank you. For this presentation, I'm going to discuss Hijras of India and compare and contrast them with transgender transgender women in India and America. The problem of where to place the Hijra in the very rigid yet increasingly confronted caste society of India is not necessarily a modern issue, but there have been many aspects of the modern era that have influenced this issue in a dramatic way. The Supreme Court of India has had a large hand in this change. Hijras, also known as India's third gender, are transgender women, generally speaking. They were assigned male at birth and they present as female in some ways, if not many ways. There's some arguments that Hijra don't transition. That's not always true, but usually that medical transition doesn't change their status anyway. And while this is true, not every transgender woman in India identifies as Hijra either, and rightfully so, because Hijras are often treated terribly. They're refused work, and on the other hand, they're tokenized due to the religious rites that only the Hijras can perform. Hijras are both accepted and treated with disgust due to the Toli Badhai that they perform. That is a blessing for infants and the people of India, although the Upanishads gives them some room to do these rites themselves. They prefer to have someone who is a Hijra because, again, they see them as both sacred and outcast. It's a very tenuous position to be in. Today, transgender people and Hijras are both fighting tooth and nail to secure their rights. This usually involves pressuring the Indian Supreme Court to make decisions in their favor. The police often deal directly with the Hijra, as there's a tendency towards sex work since steady employment is nearly impossible for them to attain. It's accepted. Again, transgender issues and the issues of Hijra are generally intertwined. The Hijras are accepted and even encouraged to live communally. And the state has even opened up some roads to employment outside of their traditional, not necessarily approved of, kind of just accepted, but not really approved of place in Indian society. This clustering of marginalized people, when they do this, it can lead to further marginalization. And unfortunately, even if monetary gains are undeniable, it is a not necessarily a free way of living, and there's not necessarily a sense of freedom for both the Hijra or trans women necessarily in India. Santa Korai was a trans activist who was arrested in Manipur because she spoke about transgender welfare funds possibly being, she claimed transgender welfare funds were being funneled in a corrupt way out of the hands of transgender people, and there's probably little doubt that was happening. But since there's no free speech rules in India for their government, the police knocked on her door and attempted to arrest her. She was not home at the time. She was in another country. The Supreme Court stopped the injunction. They saw that it was clearly they were targeting her for her activism, and luckily the Supreme Court did change the outcome of that for that woman. The Supreme Court is a representative body. It was created immediately following the successful fight for independence against British rule in 1950. Mahatma Gandhi famously employed the Vedic concept of ahimsa, or nonviolence, to help stem the colonialist tide. Ahimsa, and we know ahimsa as nonviolence. It's been famously used by Martin Luther King as well, when he was influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent protest. The formation of the Supreme Court in New Delhi helped to unify India under a government that could weigh the Varnic classifications of Indians with the changing world. The transgender women in India tend to fit into a more conservative mold. They want to separate their lives from those of the Hijra. Their status is higher, and since these trans women came from all walks of life, there is not necessarily a religious element to their struggle. With the exception of the cultural waters with which transgender women, the Hijra, the eunuchs, the intersex, or any gender nonconforming individual will have to swim in India with its grand traditions and very strict caste system. These trans women tend to be from the working class. This is not uncommon, as status is not something easily let go. Why would you want to be treated the way the Hijras are treated? And with modern communications, the trans woman who wrote those things on social media proves that people are seeing each other on social media all over the world and finding new ways to express themselves as trans, which before would kind of only have been the Hijras, would have been the only chance that these trans women would have had to express themselves. When the Supreme Court gave trans women what was called a legal status as a third gender, the court was ignoring the religious dogma of the past and allowing the full travel of Hijra and trans people that were okay with the designation of third gender. Otherwise, they could switch their gender to a binary gender. But again, the Hijras don't consider themselves binary gender. They consider themselves third gender. So there is some push and pull there. All or not, and many trans women would like to see stronger language used to enforce the protections that they have already, and they would like to aid the mobility of upper movement in the system. And for many gender non-conforming Indian people, this just isn't a possibility. The caste system places Hijras far outside of the ability to live without what modern trans women consider debasement. But by further alienating the Hijra, these trans women risk marginalizing and dehumanizing the Hijra even further. They don't want to be the Hijra. Hopefully, they will be able to lift all boats with their rising tide. The Supreme Court of India was recently petitioned by transgender people asking to make them a separate caste. This would take them out of untouchable status and afford them more rights. The government of India refused to accept this notion on the merit that trans people cut an intersection across castes. This is a blow to transgender rights, but the reasoning is hard to argue. The court contends that there are now 3 categories anyway for male, female, and transgender. That's enough to fill census duties and lift the transgender people. And Hijra's out of complete hopelessness in the eyes of the state. Many in the community and the allies of gender nonconforming people believe the efforts fall short. From my perspective as an American trans woman, I am impressed by the strides trans women all over the world are making. It wasn't long ago that trans women were considered completely taboo. Aside from their religious status, the Hijra still carry that taboo. The caste system is still alive in India. It maintains hierarchies, and with a larger and larger population, very few people find themselves in the higher echelons of that caste system. In the first census since 1947, it has been shown that over 2/3 of India belong to the outcast, which are considered backwards, and it's cruel. This makes it easier to marginalize the very bottom of the hierarchies. While the Supreme Court of India has made large strides for transgender people, it's probably not enough. The groups are still considered an underclass, and this doesn't seem like it'll change in the near future, though the distant future shows hope. The fact that transgender people are being recognized on a global scale as worthy of attaining rights, thanks to updated science and the continued push by the once silenced voice of transgender people themselves, should be enough to give us a little hope. There have been efforts to help the Hijra by keeping them ghettoized and forcing them to live in communal towns where they could, be cared for and protected. That's the idea. I want to finish with this episode of a now dated show called An Idiot Abroad. Carl Pilkington was the star. He's an everyman. He was tasked to confront his own discomfort and witness things that make up our larger world. He does a good job of trying to faithfully respect the culture he meets with. And I've added this video here because while it's not exactly the issue, it's not about Hijras, it's about dwarves in China. It mirrors faithfully what I am trying to get across, so I've deemed to include it. The culture shock can resonate deeply when marginalized people confront the way that people who mirror themselves can accept what appears to be poorer treatment than I could accept for myself. So if you're not in the group, it's definitely hard to understand the needs of the group. It's undeniable that the Hijra deserve jobs. They deserve jobs. Transgender people deserve to live in a more meritocratic world in general. The efforts to improve should be recognized, and all humans are sovereign in some ways to themselves. The state of India should do more to help. It's heartening to see that there's a place in India for traditional ways of expressing gender nonconformity through their religious practices. I hope that there's room for both the Hijra and the more progressive transgender women to flourish and live without fear of violent reprisal or economic destitution. With that, I'm going to play this scene from the episode, and it's a little quiet, so we might just get their reactions. He's not. He's a young thing. This is what annoys me with people. I'm in the thick of it here. I stood by their houses. They're all happy. There's a woman who I met who's a little dwarf. She's only been here 4 months. She's already got her own mushroom to live in. Now you tell me that's wrong. Hang on a minute. You're being all on your high horse and that. The picture that I've shown of you on the telly so people knew you were sat on a shelf. So if all your work dries up, they're not making another Star Wars, you can't dress up as a little monkey.